wherever or whenever you are. We are so grateful that you have chosen to be in this space. This morning's plenary will be delivered by Erica Galt. Erica Galt is the director of the Center for the Study of African American Religious Life and the Lilly Endowment Curator of African American Religious History at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Through her leadership, the center has produced and toured the God Talk film documentary nationally and internationally, sought to tell a more inclusive and multi-faith story of Black religions in America through exhibitions and programming. She has secured multiple multi-million-dollar fundraising, honored and spotlighted the work of justice workers in the academy and beyond, and curated critical space for leading thinkers of data justice, religion, and technology. Apart from her work at the museum, Dr. Galt is considered one of the foremost scholars of digital Black religion. She recently served as a principal investigator and published 2024 Connected Faith Survey Report. It is the first study to explicitly explore the association between digital technology use and Black religious life. After seeing her presentation of this study, I just knew that she needed to be a speaker here. So I welcome our speaker, Erica Galt.
Okay, sorry about that. I can't, I've, my connection is unstable here. I'll just try to present without the slides, and I'll try to put them in the chat at some point if it allows me to come back on using my computer. But why don't we go ahead and get started? Apologies. I'm sorry about that. Pleasure to be with you. If at any time you can't hear me, please feel free to wave your hand or unmute yourself and just let me know. First, I would like to extend a thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you today, even through unstable internet. But isn't that fitting on a conversation about technology, to have all of the challenges that go along with digital use? This talk that I'd like to give, without the bells and whistles, I have a lot of wonderful images here, so I encourage you to take a look at this, and just to help you along for those that may be looking later on at the recorded version. I'll announce each slide as it would be presented alongside it. This conversation, as Dr. Lockhart Gilroy mentions, is the outgrowth of a larger project called Connected Faith. The Connected Faith survey ran between late 2023 and March of 2024. Those findings of that study came back to me in some very unexpected ways as we went into post-elections, and in thinking about what these times are, and the incredible work. I stand on the shoulders of earlier ethnographers, Black women who have done this work, and thinking both about technology more broadly, as well about Black religion and its kind of networks. And so in thinking about what that meant, I returned to that study and thinking concurrently about that, as well as what I was seeing and hearing across social media. This conversation is the outgrowth of that. I'll stop somewhere at maybe the halfway point, if there are questions and thoughts, and invite you to, in large part, kind of think along with me about what you're hearing and seeing. If I'm on to something, or if I'm moving in a totally different direction, I welcome dissent and questions. And so feel free to raise those as we go along. So this talk is titled The Art of Possibility and Techno-Spirituality. That title, as I said, comes from the Connected Faith Survey and thinking about the findings of that survey, and also in thinking about a few more recent events that happened months, almost a year after the survey, that as someone who does this kind of qualitative research, had me thinking, wow, that sounds a lot like what I heard in the survey. And so I returned to that in trying to think about these topics together. And so one of the first things that I'd like to begin with is a story. Really, two stories, two events that I had the pleasure of attending. All of the names and all of the folks that I mentioned, unless they're public figures, are anonymized just for the purposes of limiting the surveillance that many people face online. But a event that I attended post-election, just prior to the inauguration, was a salon, and I'll describe that a little bit. They gathered around wine and cheese for what the host, a Black millennial woman, called a post-election salon. It was just before the 2025 inauguration, and emotions were high. The Republican campaign's harmful rhetoric toward women, immigrants, and communities of color had left many fearful. Some, like those 10 or so multi faith people of African descent gathered at the woman's home, they had come to buoy each other's spirits and to strategize. The host began the discussion by saying, let's imagine for a second that the presidential candidate, Kamala Harris, won the election. Before she can go further, there are noticeable sighs around the room. One person drops their head, another offers a sad sort of chuckle. The mood picks up, however, with hopeful laughter when she finishes with, who are the three artists that will perform at her inauguration? This kind of scene I'd like to couple with another which I attended a few months later. Um, and these are the remarks by one representative, Jasmine Crockett, at the 60th anniversary commemoration for El Haj Malik Shabazz. And this was February 21st. She said, one thing about Black folk, especially Black women, the 92% said, we're tired. The 92% said, the rest of y'all figure this out. But here's the reality. The 92% have always carried this country. And while we Black women may be tired, I can tell you that the 92% and everybody else is about to be in this fight. And so, in thinking about these in the aftermath of the 2024 presidential election, I thought how varied the response is. If you just took this one group of Black women across social media, was on social media as well as in person. One demographic, Black women, that was largely undivided in their vote was Black women. From think pieces and blog posts to T-shirts and mugs. And if you could see slide 4, you would notice many of these are populated here of this group called the 92% that emerged. An overwhelming number of Black women, more than any other racial or gender group, voted for Kamala Harris in the 2024 presidential election, along with TikTok videos and Instagram posts stating we did our part, were others that read, we tired, don't ask me for nothing. Concurrently, there was a buildup in events like the one which I mentioned in the first story. For other Black women, a time of rest was their response. Across social media, Black women advertised and vowed to participate in the December 2nd National Day of Rest for Black women. Black women, as these responses suggest, neither in voting nor in life represent a monolith. This talk examines the varied responses and calls for rest and reset slash imagination that occurred in the aftermath of the November 5th election among Black women. Through this discussion, Black women found, as Bell Hooks remarks, sanctuaries for making sense of their lived realities in a place where they could imagine possible futures. So, in large part, I want to talk about imagining what it means to be imagining possibilities by examining both online and offline spaces and ways Black women read and write. I want to emphasize the networks of resistance that arise between Black women who build salons or gathering places in person to strategize, and Black women's responses regarding rest online in the aftermath of the elections Around these sites of possibility, I examine shifting networks of in-person and digitally located harbors. Slide 6. Here's a few terms that I think are important in thinking through these kinds of concepts. One of those is digital Black religion and digital womanist approaches. The other is technology. And finally, the last is hush harbors. As the preceding discussion crosses a few desperate fields, it is helpful to note how the terms are taken up, I believe, in this talk. While some are best understood within the context of research, these that center around womanism, intersectional liberation, and hush harbors are quite important. To the first, around womanist approaches. Digital womanist approaches, I should say, are Black people's digital pathways to healing and wholeness, and their, or what I call in parentheses here, freedom, and their religious contribution to the development of digital technology. This is connected then with a new definition of womanism. Please humor me if you know all of this, but I want to set the scene to go into a further discussion here. The word womanism takes its meaning from Alice Walker's term womanist in Search of Our Mother's Garden, 1983. The field of womanism that emerged thereafter, guided by Walker's four-part definition, is an approach that centers the lived realities of Black women. And the 2006 book, Deeper Shades of Purple, womanist theologian Stacey Floyd Thomas describes it as a concern with the theoretical insights and identity politics concerning the life and work of Black women, work to facilitate liberation as scholarship and anti-oppressive social praxis. Womanist knowledge grants epistemological privilege to the lived, everyday realities of Black women and the difficult, often marginated issues that they confront. This focus on Black women's epistemologies or ways of knowing allows for a sustained consideration of how Black women both read text and how they read the world around them, given what they know to be true from their experiences as Black women. Reading and writing then as a mode of granting visibility, that is Black women feeling seen by other Black women, and also building knowledge networks runs throughout this discussion as a digital womanist approach to community engagement in activism. Connected to womanism then are terms like intersectionality, examining interlocking systems of oppression. This intersectional liberation, freedom for multiple identities and communities, emerges as a deeply spiritual pursuit and participant responses from the Connected Faith Survey, and why it's important to connect these two in the discussion. This other definition of technology, and one token bears no definition. We're all familiar with all of the technology that we deal with on a daily basis. But to think about this in connection to religion is to think about the spirit-centered techniques, skills, and processes, like, for instance, laying on of hands, prophecy, conjuring, as tools in producing liberation within Black religious traditions. For examples, think AI as in ancestral knowledge or ancestral intelligence. Think Harriet Tubman using prophecy or listening to God to lead people to liberation as techniques, as tools, as in themselves technologies of the spirit, and why we call them spiritual technologies. And last is this word hush harbors or brush harbors. In recent years, much has been made of hush harbors as researchers and the general public seek to understand these historical spaces and their contemporary manifestations. This remains a challenge, however, given their furtive nature. During Here, the term is used to denote the secret and mobile meeting places used for Black imagining. During antebellum slavery, they were quite often multi-faived and acted as a laboratory for the syncretized forms of Black American faith practices that we see today. And the 2020 article, The Fugitive Spirit of Historical Black Women Teachers, theorizing hush harbors as praxis. Amber Neal Stanley describes the hush harbor as creating an innovative system of codes, chants, and subversive activities. Neal Stanley moves the hush harbor from swamps and forests to the musical messages of the spirituals, and noting how the songs provided multiple meanings, signals, and hidden messages about the spiritual journey of faith, as well as the physical journey of escape. She further argues that these sites, such as Black women literary societies, schools, and clubs, rightly earned their names in their attempt at continuing the Hush Harbor tradition through education, a deeply spiritual task, she notes, from forests to songs to schools, the fluid network of Hush Harbors. And this is really important to think about these as kind of networks, and fluid ones at that, is explored here as continued in the lived practices of Black women seeking intersectional liberation today. So, why does all of this matter to know about hush harbors and to think about technology in this way, in a digital womanist kind of approach to it? For two reasons. One of those, and this is speaking from slide 7, it provides alternative models for religious education. From their inception, what I want to talk about are in 3 examples. One of them is called salons, like the one that I mentioned here. From their inception, salons were considered sites of white women intellectualism. They coexisted alongside, however, Black women's sites of intellectual meaning making. These hush harbors, as I want to call them, offer rich sites for understanding Black networks of learning and resistance, and thus alternative models for religious education. And secondly, it matters because it offers a reclamation of the human in technology. And this is womanist work. Black women's creation and use of technology for spiritual and religious purposes are often oriented around her community and her personhood. This offers a needful model for reflection and critique of existing technologies that decenter the human and its development, analysis, and or implementation. And so on slide 8, there are 3 examples that I want to offer to talk about this. The first one, I'll give away the ending at the beginning here. The first one are salons. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I found in the Connected Faith survey that aligns with the discussion of the reading and writing of Black women, which is the final one, readings by in about Black women. The first, salons. So as I mentioned, salons grew during the Italian Renaissance and French Enlightenment of the 16th and 17th century. They became synonymous with brilliant new thinkers and artists and as sites for literary innovation. particularly, however, for white women. What later gave way to the salon or large reception hall was more intimate gathering places akin to a cabinet or drawing room adjacent to her bedroom. For such women, the salon often acted as a site for informal education, particularly within societies that withheld such formal education from women, often citing biblical passages such as 1 Timothy 2:11 through 14 for support of, quote unquote, let the women learn in silence. Groups such as the mid 18th century Blue Stocking Society popularized such salons led by women and led to the establishment of gathering places beyond their homes. Salons, by and large, while providing critical space for intellectual and political discussion, were occupied and run by privileged white elites. The tradition that emerged within Black spaces took its founding not from drawing rooms, but hush harbors. In their organic and furtive nature, they harp back to earlier meeting places created by Black people in challenging times. In much the same way, they were often multi-faved and intergenerational sites of spiritual renewal and possibility. From slide 9. As well, they were often concerned with the ongoing legacy of racism and strategies for enacting freedom. Along with this, their salons were connected to a broader network of Black gatherings, such as churches and libraries. One such example is the S Street Salon, founded by poet and playwright Georgia Douglas Johnson. Johnson's own writing included one of my favorites, the classic work Heart of the Woman. Not only 1925, not only in her poetry did Johnson seek to create space for articulating the experiences of Black women, her gathering of Saturday Nighters in Northwest DC attracted popular Black artists of the time, such as Angeline Grimke, Alice Dunbar Nelson, along with prominent male artists and activists like Conte Cullins and W.E.B. Du Bois. Sites such as Johnson's home and those launched by other Black female artists of the early 20th century, like Zora Neale Hurston, created what Trevor Lindsay describes as an African-American women-centered counterpublic. These spaces were often frequented by men and women from their own homes and a wealth of creative acumen. They structure opportunities for learning and engagement that imagine new possibilities for Black flourishing. In much the same way as offered in the opening story about the salon, they often ask the what if question with flair, wit, and humor, developing the artistic landscape through their work. In the case of Johnson, this directly fueled the Negro Little Theater movement. But this long-standing pattern of creating such intimate gatherings in their broad network to other Black organizations and institutions speaks to the potential power of these sites for African diasporic people today. It became just such in-person, informal, and intimate gatherings that several Black people turned to following the November 5th election, such as the one that I mentioned in the opening here. One of the things that I began to think about in the aftermath of the election is how do you document the number of these, and what do you think of as contributing to the broad network of salons, or acting in those networks, those broader networks of freedom? And this led to thinking about what was already documented within the Connected Faith Survey. And this leads to slide 10, the Connected Faith Survey. Um, as I said before, late 2023 of November into March of the following year, the Connected Faith Survey offered 48 questions that documented roughly the responses of 400 participants who self-identified as Black or African American, and these numbers were largely Black women. Within the Connected Faith Survey, one of the things that I noticed is that there was tremendous connection between what I was hearing and seeing from Black women around the ages that for whom social cohesion was most important within their responses, and when they talked about well-being, who charted highest. And that was that demographic from about 35 to 44. Because of my connections within these communities, I was able to chart some of the same folks who I found initially on Facebook or were in Facebook groups. And so to be able to watch them in real time responding in some of the same ways that they did in the Connected Faith survey was an interesting kind of cross tabulation for me. And so looking at those responses between women between the ages of 35 and 44, and thinking about the aftermath of the election, these folks that said we did our part, and that now was the time for Black women to practice self-care instead of trying to carry the entire nation. Were some of the same Black women, but I'll talk a little bit about what makes their responses connected. Represented in the loss of Kamala Harris for many former study participants was the historical burden placed on Black women to shoulder the weight of America's work and liberation, and if need be, to sacrifice themselves for its salvation. In short, Black women were tired of having America respond to them as it had to Kamala Harris. If all liberal-minded Americans felt they experienced a severe blow with the election of Donald Trump on November 5th, 2024, this is perhaps doubly true for Black women, many of whom showed up as early supporters of her campaign. The show of solidarity from the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, for instance, at their annual meeting in Dallas, Texas, sent more than 20,000 Black women back to their home chapters, tasked with moving the needle in Harris' favor. Following her announcement across social media, Black women beamed with pride and possibility. At the same time, many, sometimes in the same breath, asked questions like, must Black women always save us? From a US Today article, following Biden's abrupt departure from the presidential race with just months to go until the election. Evident from their online moorings was the sentiment around life satisfaction revealed in the Connected Faith survey. Many Black women were inching toward frustration with their level of engagement and content creation on behalf of others already, like a year prior in the Connected Faith survey, were these kind of glimmers in their kind of response regarding this frustration. Kamala Harris' presidency was, for many Black women, an engagement with their history in America. And had she succeeded, perhaps a small restitution for what that history had meted out. Following the election, the immediate response from many Black women observed across social media focused on either we tired, quotes, or we did our part, quote, which can be viewed as a direct outgrowth of those same feelings regarding quality of life online in the Connected Faith survey. That is, life satisfaction, particularly for Black women, intellectual and spiritual content producers on and offline, was in a precarious position before the election. Voicing their dissatisfaction in the immediate aftermath for a once highly engaged group meant online disengagement. This must be understood, however, as an act of technological resistance. So initially, this was tagged as their unwillingness to participate or to be activists. However, I think it's really important to still put this in the activism category because these are, in and of themselves, ways that women have played with technology, the use of technology in the past. And this leads to thinking about what technologies of resistance actually are. Phillip Butler raises this question about whether Black people were ever really considered human, given, as he writes, that humanity is a stratification technology upholding white supremacy. In opposition to such white supremacist technologies, he argues that spiritualities between survival and dismantling systems exist among the oppressed. Yet the emphasis on quote unquote joy, peace, success, or other complexities of Black life, end quote, such as rest, in a world that thrives on anti-Blackness, suggests an orientation diametric to its real world forces. Butler then contends, for this reason, spirituality is a technology. It is a technology of resistance. Since the pandemic, this sort of techno-spirituality derived from new sacred texts emerged from Black women, such as Cole Raleigh Brown's This Here Flush, Tricia Hersey's Rest and Resistance, and this is located on slide 13. Such texts speak to Butler's assertion regarding how Black people are figured as non-human, and that through technological resistance, things like choosing to rest, for instance, they reinscribe their flush with humanity, even and especially in the digital. This affirmation of the body works to privilege Black flush as sacred, as Brown's work supports. Similarly, Hershey's work discusses rest as a form of resistance, writing that, quote unquote, you were not just born to center your entire existence on work and labor. You were born to heal, to grow, to be of service to yourself and community, to practice, to experiment, to create, to have space to dream and to connect. And connected faith responses these texts were referenced as guiding religious and spiritual experiences by several study participants. Black women respondents had read these works, heard sermons focused on their principles, and had transformative experiences through their participation in digital groups and podcasts that engaged such texts in the years and months leading up to the election. These sorts of techno-spiritual engagements render Black bodies seen and celebrated across physical and digital platforms. Rest then must be taken seriously, as these texts became part of a broader constellation of digital spiritual ideas for Black women. As Audre Lorde writes, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. Often, the danger of playing within the structured logic of the internet has been how it stifles creative thinking, encourages groupthink, and for Black women creators, neutral life satisfaction. Against such logics, rest allows space for rich imagination, making it a site of radical political possibility. Black women joined these readings with others like Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sowers, podcasts like Octavia Tried to Tell Us. And all of these texts have something quite profound and imaginative to say about the present in the future. Taken together, Parable of the Sower, This Here Flush, even movies like Wicked, which is a conversation in and of itself, and several others acted as nodes of actors in a network tied together by Black women's desire for intersectional liberation. And that brings me to my kind of final point. But before I do that, I want to check in and see if there are questions or how I'm doing on time.
You are doing just fine on time. We have
Okay.
no less than an hour left.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. So here's what I'm thinking about both the use of Black women here and why it's so important to this conversation is just this thing about possibility and imagination, thinking about what's possible. So here, theories of social networking are most important within a digital Black womanist framework. Social network analysis assists in our understanding of how information, ideas, objects, and actors create alliances or networks, particularly in the digital space. This talk argues that a broader network spanning the digital but also physically located spaces and text forms the connective tissue that bind communities and common thought, and that Black women, through reading and writing, continue to work this tissue to produce new possibilities for themselves and their communities. It is most useful in this context then to focus in on that connective tissue, or what one scholar, Zinuglu, calls consistently persistent relationships between nodes. To fully understand this network, the flow of ideas from books to digital groups to content creators speaks of an important network for understanding Black spirituality at present, and where its sites of activism might soon emerge. The Connected Faith Survey reveals these quote unquote consistently persistent relationships, and to a certain extent even acts as a node, as respondents actually shared the survey and likely discussed its findings and their participation in it in the group. And I should just say, as a plug, if you're interested in the broader findings of the survey, you can find the full report at Connected Faith. digitalblackreligionsurvey.com, digitalblackreligionsurvey.com. And there's actually a slide, the final slide and the second slide, that has that link as well. As mentioned earlier, given the fluidity and limitless nature of such relationships, it is difficult to measure the number or kinds of influential nodes on the network within this talk. While this talk raises key examples for qualitative content analysis, further large-scale survey analysis is needed in this area. However, if we examine just the relationship, just the relationship or the flow itself as a space, we see with greater visibility both the strength of reading spaces for Black women and how Black women read or see communal space as one of relationship building. Yet it must be noted that it is only important in the context of this talk to call these spaces so that the reader notes and the listener notes their stanchion nature in creating and holding room for intersectional liberation. Yet they are the same ties that Black women created in calling together Saturday nighters in the early 20th century, and in what we now call hush harbors. More than a node or a physically located site, these relationships held space for freedom, work, and freedom rest. In the 2021 book, Digital Black Feminism, Catherine Knight Steele draws on early 20th century letters and news talks to think comparatively about the use of blogs and tweets for Black women's modern activism. I'm also thinking about Brittany Cooper's Beyond Respectability and thinking about these networks. These technologies allow Black women space for reading and writing about their freedom and that of their community. Steele also notes the essentiality of Black women in gathering and employing these technologies, both historically and at present. This tells us both why they were likely tired following the elections that Black women have been up to a lot for a couple centuries here now, but also their potential for launching a response given the broad networks at their disposal. And so this moves me to somewhere near my close, thinking about conjuring possibility. Um, in Africana Religion in the Digital Age, which is one of the first works to talk explicitly about digital Black religion, colleague and scholar friend Margarita Guillory says in Africana Religion in the Digital Age, she talks about techno-conjuring devices as she weaves these beautiful stories together about her mother positioning natural objects in her home, and similar practices occurring through podcasts and other forms of digital media. She talks about techno-conjuring devices as these technical tools strategically implemented to rearrange nature to obtain desired results. Guillory is concerned with the way marginalized persons work in the in-betweens and liminal spaces to creatively reshape their world. Techno-conjuring devices act as powerful tools in both resistance and overcoming white supremacy. For this talk's purposes, the concern lies within the imaginative nature of these liminal spaces and the creative potential in conjuring new realities through spiritual practices like reading and writing. It's not just picking up a book for leisure, but there's something really quite political that's happening here. Techno conjuring devices speak to the catalytic role of Black women and the creative networking of reading and writings. By employing such devices as the parable of the sower, or rest and resistance, or myriad of other texts, sermons, or TikTok videos, Black women imagine new possibilities for freedom. Slide 13 and slide 14 talks about this kind of possibility more. Slide 13. Much like the Black women discussed throughout this talk, it is in her reading and reimagining of Home in The Wizard of Oz that Bell Hooks writes, I found a place of sanctuary in theorizing and making sense out of what was happening. I found a place where I could imagine possible futures, a place where life could be lived differently. I want to read that last part once more since you're not seeing what I'm seeing. I want to really put emphasis there. I found a place where I could imagine possible futures, a place where life could be lived differently. This place to imagine possible futures is perhaps the most powerful allowance of techno conjuring devices and the sort of techno spiritual networks that Black women create. Asking what ifs, as the Black millennial woman in the opening story does, or as Jasmine Crockett resets and calls Black women from their rest into the fight in the second quote that I shared with you, is a masterclass, or better yet, an anti masterclass, and how Black women have historically stirred imagination and called communities to better possible futures, to a place where life can be lived differently. As such, these networks represent potentially important possibilities for engagement and activism, as they offer distressed and oppressed persons sanctuary or hush harbors, both for making sense or resting from the terror that they endure, and space for imagination. When imagination is stirred, what ifs can move very easily to what is. And this brings me to my second to last slide, slide 14, technologies of resistance, conjuring possibilities. Perhaps the greatest challenge in the present moment is the challenge to maintain one's hope. See, we can talk about things like digital tools and approaches to technology, but there are currently those that I am mindful of, those who are living lives under the crushing weight of the recent bill, of lost jobs and dwindling possibilities, and weapons, then technologies that have been weaponized against many groups currently. And these are dark days that we are living in. And I think then of a few quotes in drawing to the close. One of those from Ta-Nehisi Coates, where he says, and we were 8 years in power. I don't ever want to forget that the resistance must be its own reward, since resistance, at least within the span of our lives, of the life of the resistors, almost always fails. And I was thinking about these in these very dark times that we are living through. What does it mean to be engaging on the topic of technology? Particularly because technology is often touted by the AI evangelists as the next big thing that will revolutionize all of our lives, or by the technology critiquers who say that we need to do away with all technology. This is the end. And thinking about these times, what is possible, and looking at the rich work from Black women as a site for stirring imagination and also restoring hope in very difficult times. And so this slide begins with just three words: imagination, hope, and human. Under imagination, it's important to remember that imagination is this call and this kind of vocation that at several times when Black women have talked historically about possibility and about things like what ifs, it is this way of stirring imagination, not for the resistance at present, but in thinking about what the future can be and imagining that we always fail, quite unfortunately, in the present, but we are also living through and the product of the gains of a civil rights movement. We are living through and are living the living embodiment, as they say, of our ancestors. We are their wildest dreams. And so, in thinking about the work of Black women and the use of technology and that, I turn in these times to Walter Brueggemann. I think it's fitting, given his recent passing, to use a quote of his. And if we are to think about Black women in their futuring role, to think about them as prophets, then I want to remove the word prophet and insert just her name here and quoting him and say, it is the vocation of Black women to keep alive the ministry of imagination, to keep on conjuring and proposing futures alternative to the single one the king wants to urge as the only thinkable one. This, according to Walter Brueggemann, he argues is the way that we stir up a new kind of hope. Hope is really important. It's one of these words that's touted about quite often. But if one imagines, then one has the capacity for hope as well. And hope always calls into question the present. It says that the present does not always have to be, and just as well, something is wrong with the present, but through hopeful imagination, the future can look brighter. And finally, to think about this is also to think about the way that this technology of resistance has always been useful in rescuing the human from the automated. I'm thinking perhaps here in the origins of Elon Musk. I'm thinking about the way in which Dodge started out as if we can crunch all the numbers and if we have access to all of the data, if we can automate this thing, then we can run an entire government and maybe even the world, which became largely unsuccessful, as many of us knew that it would. But the way in which the human becomes most important in rescuing, once again, the technology. And so the technologies of resistance are always about recentering the human and always expose and critique in these very useful ways, the ways in which other technologies that seek terror operate against human beings. And I say all of this in thinking hopefully about what comes next. But I also want to be very realistic as we gather in this moment. Large language models like ChatGPT and other AI technologies, as well technocrats who believe that these networks and other systems that operate against technologies of resistance should really be in control of our governments and of our systems. That constantly it becomes important, I think, in these kinds of moments to raise up once again the possibilities within technologies of resistance. One of the talks that I'll give later in the week kind of extends this conversation and is really a part two. I asked the question here, what if Kamala Harris won? But there is an online conversation in much the same way that asks the question, what if she did actually win? And technology, through another stolen election, tells us that something else perhaps occurred. These used to be conspiracy theories, but now we have to actually weigh them given what we know about the possibilities with our technologies. But for our purposes, what becomes most important in this versus technologies of resistance against technologies of terror is to keep in mind that these technologies of resistance are always, must always be centered on freedom. And so it must not be forgotten that at the center of this whole discussion on Black women is one Black woman in particular. While referenced earlier, Kamala Harris hasn't really been explored in this conversation. It's important to note, however, her role symbolically so here, and the significant role Black women figure in this broader analysis as a new network of freedom continues to be created. Their voices join with election skeptics of every hue and an even broader network of tech billionaires who supported her bid for the White House. The last of which could actually be instrumental as the once California senator regroups in the fragmented, beleaguered Democratic Party finds its footing or democracy altogether begins anew. To begin her 2024 presidential campaign, Harris' team tapped another iconic Black female voice, Beyonce, agreed to use the song Freedom for the 2016 Lemonade album, featuring Kendrick Lamar, whose song All Right has also figured as another generation's guiding spiritual in a time of hush harbors. Beyonce marks a definitive node in Black women's networks and received several mentions in the Connected Faith survey as providing spiritual text for Black women's lives. And so I'll close there with the question that she asked: Freedom, freedom, where are you? As Black women continue to raise such questions across platforms, they are joined by a growing chorus of other voices. Such networks may well shake up the entire system. Thank you.
Thank you. And as the only unmuted person, thank you for that presentation.
Thank you.
You see all of the applause. We are now going to open up for questions. So I invite participants to either use the react button and raise a hand or type your question into the chat, and then I will read it out loud. As people are doing that, I will ask a question. So as we are seeing these digital hush harbors in some ways being rated, whether it be people's social media posts or various things being held against them, people being detained because of what they post, bots entering spaces, right? Are you seeing people simply kind of move away, find different ways to, how do they find different ways to protect that space is my question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great question. As I was writing and thinking about this, all of this is happening so quickly and in such real time. As well, the social media platforms were shifting as well. So post-election and even before that, the kind of Twitter takedown that occurred really left fragmented communities that once gathered in hashtags or even in the comments into other places. And it felt as if it was a good time to talk about rest because there felt like there was a silence as people dealt with the shock of what happened and where to go next. And I think those are fragments that are gathering in a number of different ways in different places to date. And we are still really piecing together what that looks like. And so, in large part, in talking about hush harbors, is my way as an ethnographer, both in documenting this thing and also in the spirit of techno conjuring to kind of conjure up what imagination might look like, where people might go next. So I would say that that's still a question that is being answered in real time, and it has several answers. Like some are choosing to go fully offline. Salons are one of the incarnations of that. These kind of informal gatherings, and ways of thinking about what movement looks like that is not digital. And when I talked in networking the Black church on the subject of just what millennials were up to. One of the things that I noticed by the time that I got to the end of that book was that I was kind of through with the internet, and so were the millennials that I was studying. And I said, that's not the worst thing,
Right.
one millennial, Candace Bimbo, said, we have not come to the end of our internet. There's other ways of engaging this thing that people are finding, and this could be the site of great imagination too.
Excellent. Thank you. Are there any questions from our participants? Eileen.
Thank you for that illumination, Dr. Galt. Very, very good. I'm a little fuzzy yet on how to ask this question. So I may blah, blah, blah ramble a bit. I apologize for that. The tech companies are strongly focused on getting users, buyers, clicks, all of that. And I guess I wonder, are they yet targeting Black women to distract them from this work you're talking about? Like, it's not only the political that is a potential surveillance on us, right? Any of us. Are the capitalist forces also going after the people who are working in the context, who are having the salons, who are doing that kind of work? Are they as pulled toward the bottomless pit of clickbait as the rest of us?
Yeah, so yeah, I hear you. That's a difficult question for many of the same reasons of fragmentation that I talked about in my last answer. There are varied responses to capitalism, as there always have been. That it's important to play ball, to keep the movement alive, or to totally disengage. So particularly when you talk about people who have been doing the work prior to this kind of moment, and you have created spiritual communities that are very tech savvy, that are thinking about this as a time where you can't disengage, that you do have to learn the master's tools, basically, is one approach. And another is that you have to be as multi-pronged in the attack as the technologies of terror are. And so when I talk about these networks, that they are not just news sites that we go to. So when it seemed Twitter was failing, some asked the question, okay, where are we going next? Is it blue sky? And that was meaningful for some folks. But in opening up the field of imagination, I would like for us to think about historically the way in which the Hush Harbor has always been a collection of sites, events, books, ways of thinking that have been employed in their entirety for a broader movement. And so, to your question, yes, for some folks, the answer is to get down in much the same way as the oppressor does. But for a number of others, I hope we have entered a space of rich imagination, where where we are honest about where we are, but we also began to think, it's not where we are, is where we can be, that we focus our attention and move towards, and asking these kind of what if questions. And I do see this kind of stirring of imagination, that is taking place, while we look to our government and these traditional systems. I don't I don't know that it's there, in these kind of older ways of thinking, Democrat or Republican. Um, the techno spiritual place always expands the field, always thinks much broader. Is always thinking about the freedom, the kind of liberation of whole communities. It is Harriet Tubman, just launching out, and having this kind of spiritual knowledge and understanding of nature, that can't be counteracted by the traditional systems of patriarchy and capitalism. There's something there about imagination, even if one does not buy into the spiritual meaning, and much the same perspective or outlook, that Harriet Tubman has. There's something there about imagination that sees something, into the future past what the present looks like. I don't know if that's answering your question, but it's perhaps thinking in the same direction.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
Excellent, thanks. We have a question from Mary Hess, which will be followed by a question from Karen Mosby.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
I'll be shorter in my responses, I promise.
This is wonderful, and I hope you'll remember to put your slides somewhere, to find them, because it's just really catalyzed stuff for me. I'm curious. Yesterday, to me, Spencer Helms gave this awesome paper, and she was talking about practices that she was engaging in, pedagogical practices, and one of the things she talked about as an element of that practice was rejecting optimization as divinity. And I think there's this way in which technology, like you were saying, even for people who aren't necessarily spiritual, this. Well, I was thinking, what happens when we make the technology the divinity? What happens when we don't, I mean, she talked about honoring vulnerability, teaching from the glitch. I think those two, I think her work and your work really intersect well, but I guess I'm wondering about how you see it, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Yeah, so one of the things that is not wonderful, and has been really, quite scary, in looking at the present administration, is, this kind of, alignment, with tech folks, Silicon Valley, folks, that would like to have the network as the state, that ultimately the older tradition of a president in charge, ultimately gives way to this kind of network system in which, technologists rule, and tech billionaires are in charge. So there's that possibility. I like this other way of thinking about it, as well, where we think about the technology as a tool, more so than we think about, the technology as broadly, taking over. And so it should give all of us deep hesitation whenever, like I talked about, when the tech evangelists are like, this next new thing is going to, these are new gods, for many folks. And if we lay down at the altars of technology, we never get to be fully human again, in the same way. And so those are some of the questions that I'm always asking of technology and approaches to technology, is who's harmed, by this, but more so those old questions about, in social justice, and liberationist thinking, who benefits, the most from this, and always trying to figure out how do we continuously center the human, not in totally warding off technology, but in how we use and build better systems ethically from the beginning.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you. Karen?
Um, Dr. Galt, I want to first thank you for your presentation to us, and to thank you for your work. Your book, Networking the Black Church, was especially helpful to me as I was trying to sort through my own thinking. And maybe it's just the generation that's behind me and the generation that I grew up in. I'm especially thankful for the ways in which your work um, um, foregrounds the work that we have done, that has been done historically uh, by people of African descent and probably other folk as well. But I am mindful of this strong attack on to attempt to erase history, and in our history, right, is so much wisdom. Even you're talking about the brush harbors and the ways in which uh, African Americans, Blacks, persons of African descent have utilized critically the resources at hand. So it really wasn't always doing the same thing over and over, but this task of surviving and thriving and being human has been centered. And I keep going back to that again. Maybe it's just the generation that I am a part of. It's like I have to talk about that. And when I hear people talking about our history and what has been done and the ways in which people are even today utilizing it critically, um, it's so important to me. So I appreciate that. And I'll wrap it up in the second part, is that I appreciate your ending with hope. I think hope gets a bad rap, uh, but I don't know how to survive or thrive without some critical concept of hope. So I don't have a question, I'm just talking. I appreciate you naming that. And Mayan Latron, in her book, Reset the Heart, she talks about insurrectional and resurrectional hope. And I'm kind of stuck on that right now is, yeah, but whatever you call it, how do we do our work without some sense of hope? So appreciate you naming that, even in the context of the 21st century and resistance today.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you, Dr. Mosley. Yeah. I've been I think many of us in these moments have been asked this question and asking this question. Well, what do we do? What do we do? What's the strategy? What's the plan? But it's got to be something more fundamental than that to my mind, because as Brueggemann talks about, we have the capacity to implement a number of things and have, however, to maintain imagination, to maintain the capacity for hope is something that is a tool that needs to be sharpened and maintained even more than that. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? And as we wait on that, I also want to say that I was struck by the resistance must be its own reward. To think about that for a minute. I do think that people often think about the reward as the result, right? As opposed to the resistance in and of itself. So that was
Yeah.
extremely helpful for me. So thanks for that. Catherine Turpin in the chat has a question. Dr. Galt, I know that your research was focused more on millennial Black women, but I'm curious if along the way you noticed anything about how younger Black women and girls were or were not connected to these digital hush harbors, or whether they have their own forms of spiritual resistance and connection.
Yeah, so great question. Thank you. So, a younger scholar friend of mine brought to my attention, well, that's what y'all felt over on Facebook, and I felt old. I was like, well, yeah, I guess millennials, you have grandkids now. You know, like this was in their conversation. But there are some unique differences, and I think more research can and needs to be done. And that younger colleague just finished her dissertation and talks about some of those podcasts. But I would say one of the things, so Facebook is still nice from a researcher standpoint, for me, because it is intergenerational conversations that are being had, to see what the young folks are doing. Though you really need to do a deeper dive into TikTok, where the conversations on rest were not necessarily, in the 92%, were not necessarily connected to religion. If I had to guess, I would think that that has something to do with the greater need for cohesion and community, that was referenced in surveys by Black women as they aged, as not so important in providing a religious community as it was for younger women. So that was one of the bigger differences. What that meant for how they understood post-election, how they understand religion, there's a lot more that needs to be done, and I'm actually waiting for the study that really does that kind of deep dive of Black women's spirituality in TikTok, because it'll capture that demographic.
Excellent, thanks. It's funny, I think that some of us still think of millennial as equal to young adult, young person,
Yeah.
and not think that, they are kind of in the
Yeah,
Right.
their backs and knees hurt. I'm an elder millennial.
Right. We're talking 30s and 40s here.
Yeah.
Excellent. I have actually been intrigued by the amounts of podcasts that have been, new since the pandemic. So it's interesting that you mentioned podcast in the sense of some of those that are deliberate conversations, a space where you can craft the kind of conversations that you want. And I found a few that are pretty life-giving, which I didn't expect to find. I was just following the YouTube algorithms, but
That's how it goes.
yeah. If there are no other questions or comments, I would like to thank you so much, Dr. Galt, for sharing this time with us and for sharing your words and knowledge with us. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you. The pleasure was mine. Thank you for bearing through through the technological difficulties with me. Yes, thank you so much.